Is there anything we can do now to prevent the ultimate collapse of the American societal lintel? The integrity of the two pillars holding up American society has been compromised. The cracks are running through them, and only one pillar needs to be taken out to collapse the entire structure. Before we can even consider our options for repair and strengthening of the pillars, we need to identify the damage already done. Even then, I am not certain we can prevent a complete collapse. And just to muddy the waters even more and continue to mix all my metaphors, consider each thread pulled from the country's foundational fabric as a crack in one of the foundational pillars. And the foundational pillars, when in concert with one another, shared language and shared values, these foundational pillars are the civilization's culture. And that shared culture is expressed not only in the language and in the values, but also in the arts and the priorities of its people. I mean, when people are asked or when they start thinking, what is a society's culture? What does our culture look like? What do they think about even that word culture? Is it really high culture they are thinking about? The arts, fine arts? And even if we're talking about fine arts, what does that mean? Are we talking about painting and sculpture, architecture, music, dances like ballet, ballroom, or is it a different kind of culture? Are we talking about dances like hip hop and breakdancing? Is there a difference between a society's culture and high culture? Should there be? I mean, because when you think about that word culture, what about where does literature and the language arts come into play? And then another question, do we find our culture reflected in the entertainment of our age, whether it be novels or magazines, Broadway, theater, rock concerts or opera, symphonies? Or do we find it in our films and TV and streaming services? And is it reflecting our culture or is it influencing our culture, right? Do we find our culture? Can we define our culture with what we find on social media? And we are about to get into what American culture really is about, but we could also talk about philosophy and intellectualism. Where do these elements play a part in our culture? And do all these fine arts reflect reality? Or does our reality reflect what we are taught in the arts, what we see and is what is promoted in our entertainment industry? We will get back into the importance of values and language in shaping our culture, but it is called culture because it takes cultivation. So culture isn't what just happens within a society. If we desire a garden instead of a yard, or even a lawn instead of a yard, that takes intentionality. And just like a garden must be cultivated by feeding the plants we want, pruning the wayward stems and branches, weeding the flower beds, keeping the rabbits out, the productive fruit-bearing plants of a culture must be fed and watered and harvested. Another thing to consider is, what is the purpose of the garden we're supposed to be taking care of and cultivating? Is it beauty? Is it variety? Is it that aesthetic? Or is it more like an orchard? Are we producing fruit and particular blooms for a particular occasion? I think we forget that there are always fruits of the labor. Like, there is fruit in a lot of our endeavors, but for fruit to be truly enjoyed, the fruit must be harvested. For it to provide nutrition, it has to be eaten, right? So, and for the flowers to bloom in all their glory and for the beauty of the garden to be complete, all the unwanted and unsightly weeds, which are feeding off the same soil as the desired elements of the garden, those weeds must be regularly pulled. And before they go to seed, because if you don't do it before they go to seed, the weeds seeds, who are planted in the same fertile soil as the blooms and the shrubs and the beautiful plants that we want in our garden, these weeds can easily take over and choke out the beautiful garden we're trying to cultivate. And what does that look like in a society? Can you see this analogy? For example, what ideas maybe should have been pulled out before the abundance of seeds of these bad ideas planted in the fertile soil that was there to develop good ideas? What weed ideas or even weed behaviors have we allowed to thrive and flourish to the point of being able to reproduce exponentially without any challenge? The flowers must get the right amount of sun for their temperament. The mulch must often be relaid, and maybe even the sod needs to be replaced on occasion. It's not just about pulling out the bad stuff. It is about replacing and rebuilding the good stuff that was initially necessary at the beginning to produce the beautiful garden. Not just the right seeds, but the very ground they are grown in, the soil, the mulch, the nutrients must be replenished from time to time. So must the good shrubs and flowering plants be trimmed and pruned. And you know what? If any bugs have infested these wanted plants, maybe even those have to be pulled or at least sprayed to spray the bugs to prevent the bugs from killing not just the entire plant, but that entire section of the garden. But Americans have lived a certain way so long, they have taken their garden for granted. They stopped watering and they stopped weeding. And just like the gardener must be vigilant against rabbits and the farmer must be vigilant against his enemy who comes sowing tares, Americans have not been vigilant. They let down their guard years ago, failed to notice imposters and trespassers, and cannot even recognize the work the enemy has done. So here I'm making reference to a parable found in the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. This is where Jesus is telling a story about a farmer who planted wheat in his field. And while the workmen, his workmen, were sleeping, so apparently this is at night in the dark, but relatively soon after the wheat was planted, this enemy comes in and plants tares. And these are considered to be darnel seeds, so he's planting tares among the same rows as the wheat. And so when the wheat starts sprouting, starts growing, so did the darnel, so did the tares. And darnel is actually poisonous. So when the workmen ask the farmer, they see, oh, there's other plants coming up. They ask the farmer if he wants them to go out and pull up the tares. And the farmer says no, because if you try to pull up the tares, you're going to also uproot some of the good wheat with it. So instead, just let the wheat and tares grow until the harvest. So that's kind of the story. The reality is, though, darnel only looks like wheat until the wheat matures. Americans, though, even mistake the tares the enemy has sown for the wheat they thought they were successfully growing and sharing with the rest of the world. I will refer back to this analogy later in the book, but we cannot even see the difference between the wheat and the tares, yet we are treating the poison darnel like wheat. We're cooking with it, eating it, and then wondering why it makes us sick. Wheat and tares look very similar, and it can be very difficult to discern between them. Look at the pictures. Do you know which is which? So what were we not paying attention to? What creeped in? Which plants we think are wheat are truly tares? What wheat have we pulled up, believing it to be tares? What threads are being pulled, unraveling the fabric of American society? What cracks have we allowed to spread throughout the pillars of Western civilization in general, and those of the United States in particular? Yup, now comes the fun part where I start identifying some cracks in the pillars and threads pulled out of that fabric. But before we get there, which will be the next episode, I want to remind everyone, especially if you have not been tracking with us, this political philosophy that I wrote is not about supporting or demonizing a particular party or a particular candidate. I think there's enough division and polarization out there to go around, and I'm not trying to stoke that at all. I'm trying to do the opposite. I had an urgency to point out what I am seeing, was seeing, still seeing, but in a way that I hope at least any American can grasp, regardless of whomever they supported in the last election or plan to support in the next election. Because if you have been tracking, or even if you haven't, you have to also remember the drum that I have been beating over and over again is that solutions are not found in elections. We should not be turning to our government and our government officials for solutions. And we should not want our solutions to be found in elections. This is not about democracy. So if you stick with me until the very end of the book, we will find out where some of these solutions actually do lie. But the first thing we need to do is stop focusing on the division that they want us to focus on, which is political party and candidates and inflammatory topics and issues. So I hope you'll stick with me starting chapter 8 next time.